Connected communities. In a down-and-out neighborhood on Boston's South Side, a vacant lot has been turned into a community garden, where neighbors gather each spring and summer to tend cabbage, kale, and tomatoes. On the fence, a hand-painted sign reads, "Please respect our efforts." This small message of hope calls for a willingness to help out a neighbor. Will a group of teens loitering on a corner be allowed to intimidate a smaller child walking by? Or will an adult tell them to disperse, perhaps even call their parents? Respect and caring make the difference, as they do between an abandoned garbage-strewn lot frequented by drug dealers and a shared vegetable garden. In the mid-1990s, a coalition of black ministers took to the stoops and corners in Boston's toughest neighborhoods to engage the kids hanging out on the streets and bring them into after-school programs led by local adults. The murder rate in Boston plunged from 151 in 1991 to just 35 10 years later, just as it did in other cities across the country. During the 1990s, a nationwide decline in crime rates was largely attributed to the economic boom. But apart from such broad forces, the question remains, can weaving people together, as those black ministers did, in itself help reduce crime on a given block? The answer to this street-level question has come from the largest analysis of community involvement in crime yet done, a 10-year study headed by psychiatrist Felton Earls of Harvard. It suggests that the answer is a strong yes. With a research group, Earls made videotapes of 1,408 blocks of street life in 196 Chicago neighborhoods, including the poorest and most crime-ridden. They documented everything from church bake sales to drug deals. The tapes were compared with crime records for those same neighborhoods, as well as with interviews from 8,782 neighborhood residents. The Earls Group found two primary influences on a neighborhood's crime rate. The first is the neighborhood's overall level of poverty. High poverty rates have long been known to hide crime, as does illiteracy, another hidden factor. The second is the degree of connection among the people in a community. The mix of poverty and disconnection in tandem exert a stronger influence over an area's crime rates than the standard factors usually cited, including race, ethnic background, or family structure. Even in the poorest neighborhoods, Earls found positive personal connections were associated not just with lower crime rates, but also with less drug use among young people, fewer unwanted teen pregnancies, and a rise in children's academic performance. Many low-income African-American communities have strong mutual help traditions through churches and extended families. Earls sees extending this neighbor-helping-neighbor spirit as a fruitful crime-fighting strategy. If a local group cleans graffiti off the walls, future graffiti will likely be less than if the city's work crew comes in and cleans the walls. A neighborhood crime watch means the local kids have the security of knowing that caring eyes are on them. In the world's impoverished neighborhoods, that attitude counts most when it comes to neighbors acting to protect one another, and most especially each other's children. No more stinking thinking. The son of an old friend, I'll call him Brad, became a binge drinker in his teen years, and when drunk, he all too readily became combative and even violent. This behavior had led to a series of brushes with the law, until finally he was sentenced to prison for seriously hurting a classmate in a fight in his college dorm. When I visit Brad in prison, he tells me, no matter what the charge, basically all the guys are in here because of a bad temper. He was fortunate to have been assigned to a special pilot program for prisoners who show some promise for changing their ways. Those living in this 6-cell special unit get a daily seminar on topics such as telling the difference between actions based on creative thinking, stinking thinking, or no thinking. In the rest of the prison, fights and posturing to intimidate are the order of the day. Brad's challenge, he knows, will be to learn to manage his anger in a social world where violence and toughness determine one's place in the hierarchy of the jail yard. That world, he tells me, is based on an us versus them paranoia in which anyone in a uniform is the enemy, as is anyone who works with them. All these guys are easily pissed off, irritated at the least little thing, and they settle any disagreement by fights. But in my program, you don't have to live that way. Still, Brad has had his hassles. There was this one kid about my age who came into our program. He was continually taunting and ridiculing me, always ragging on me. He made me really mad, but I didn't let my anger take over. At first I would just walk away, but he would follow me wherever I went, always in my face. Then I told him he was just being stupid and that it didn't matter to me what he said, but he kept at it relentlessly. Finally, I let myself feel my anger enough so I could yell at him. I stood my ground. I screamed in his face, telling him how stupid he was. Then we were just glaring at each other. It looked like we were going to get in a fight. The way you have a fight here is to go into a cell together and lock the door behind you. That way the guards don't see you. You fight until one guy gives up, and then you come out. So we went into my cell and locked the door, but I didn't want to fight. I just said to him, "If you want to go ahead and take a punch at me, do it now. I've been hit lots of times. I can take it. But I am not going to fight you." He didn't punch me. We ended up talking for an hour or two. He told me what he was all about, and I told him what I was all about. The next day, he was transferred out of our unit. But when I see him in the yard now, he doesn't hassle me anymore. Brad's program typifies those that the Kalamazoo Task Force identified as best for young offenders. Teens incarcerated for aggressive offenses who go through similar training programs, where they learn to stop and think before reacting, to consider solutions and the consequence of different responses, and to stay cool-headed, get in fewer fights, and are less impulsive and inflexible. But unlike my young friend, most prisoners never get to correct the habits and circumstances that keep them trapped in the cycle of release, relapse, and prison again. Since only a minority of released prisoners avoid being sent back to prison, the term used for this system, corrections, seems a tragic misnomer. Nothing gets corrected. Instead, for the most part, prisons are colleges for crime, strengthening an inmate's predilection and skill sets for criminality. Younger prisoners make the very worst kind of connections in prison, typically becoming mentored by more seasoned inmates, so that on their release, they are hardened, angry, and endowed with greater skills as criminals. The circuits of the social brain for empathy and for regulating emotional impulses, perhaps the two most glaring deficiencies among the prison population, are among the last parts of the human brain to gain anatomical maturity. A tally of prisoners in state and federal facilities shows that about 1/4 are under the age of 25. Not too late to nudge these circuits into a more law-abiding pattern. Careful evaluation of present-day prison rehabilitation programs has found these targeting juvenile offenders are among the most successful in preventing a return to crime. Those programs might become more effective by borrowing methods from the many well-proven school-based courses in social and emotional learning. These courses teach basic lessons like managing anger and conflicts, empathy, and self-management. In schools, these programs have reduced the number of fights by 69%, bullying by 75%, and harassment by 67%. The question is how well these efforts could be adapted for use with a teenage or 20-something prison population, or conceivably even older inmates. The prospect of reinventing prison to offer a remedial neural education is an intriguing point of leverage for society. To the extent that such programs for first-time offenders and young criminals spread, the number of prisoners nationwide will certainly fall as the years go on. Keeping the youngest criminals from embarking on a continued life of crime will do much to dry up the human rivers that now swell our prisons. An exhaustive analysis of the 272,111 prisoners released from U.S. correctional facilities in 1994 found that over their criminal careers, they had been arrested for a total of nearly 4,877,000 crimes, an average of more than 17 criminal charges each. And those were only the crimes they had been charged with. With the right corrective, that lifetime tally might well have ended right toward the beginning. But the odds now are that the first-time offenders will go on to a career in crime, adding inexorably to their toll of law-breaking as the years go on. When I was young, we used to call juvenile prisons reform schools. They actually could be such if they were designed as learning environments that enhance the skills people need to stay out of jail. Not only literacy and job training and placement, but self-awareness, self-control, and empathy. If they were, we could make prison a place where neural habits are literally reformed. Reform schools in the deepest sense. As for Brad, When I checked 2 years later, he had gone back to college and was supporting himself with a busing job in a fancy restaurant. He had been living in a house with some of his old friends from high school, but as he told me, they weren't at all serious about school. They were just into getting drunk and fighting, so I chose to move out. He moved in with his father and kept focused on his studies. Although it meant losing some old friends, he says, "I have no regrets. I'm happy." Strengthening connections. Early one morning in June 2004, a fire ravaged the Moods Covered Bridge, long a landmark in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. When the arsonists were arrested 2 months later, the community was shocked. The 6 young men were well-known graduates of the local high school, all from good families. People were puzzled and outraged. The whole community felt victimized, robbed of a precious link to a more idyllic time. At a meeting of townspeople with the 6 arsonists, one of the boys' fathers expressed his anger at strangers who had attacked him and his son in local media. But he also admitted, when asked how his son's crime had affected him, that he thought about it constantly, couldn't sleep, and felt his stomach was in knots. And then, overcome, he wept. As they listened to the pain expressed by their family and their neighbors, the young men were distraught and contrite. They apologized and said they wished they could undo what they had done. The meeting was an exercise in restorative justice, which holds that in addition to punishment, criminals should face the emotional aftermath of what they have done and make amends where possible. The Kalamazoo Plan puts special emphasis on restorative justice among the active ingredients in effective crime fighting. In such programs, mediators often arrange for some way the criminal can repair the specific damage done, whether by making payments, by hearing about the crime from the victim's point of view, or by apologizing with genuine remorse. In the words of the manager of one such program in a California prison, the victim impact sessions are very emotional. For many men, it's the first time they get the connection between their crime and the victim. Emarco Washington was one of those California men. As a teenager, he had been addicted to crack, resorting to robbery and assault to support his habit. He was especially abusive to his mother when she would not give him money for drugs. By 30, he had served time almost every year since he was a teen. After going through restorative justice programs combined with training in violence reduction in the San Francisco jail, Washington did something different on his release. He called his mother and apologized. "I told her I had been angry when she wouldn't give me money before, but the last thing I wanted to do was to hurt her. It was like a rain washing over me. That told me if I changed my behavior, my language, I could prove to myself and to others I wasn't a bad seed." The emotional subtext of restorative justice urges offenders to change their perception of their victims from it to you, to awaken empathy. Many crimes by young people are committed while they are drunk or high. In a sense, the victims don't exist for the perpetrators, nor do the youth have any sense of responsibility for hurting people. By forging an empathic link between the perpetrator and the victim, restorative justice adds to the circle of connection that can be so powerful in turning a young life around. The Kalamazoo group identified another important turning point, that perilous moment when a young prisoner returns home. Without intervention, it's all too easy for young people to slip back into their old groups, their old habits, and more often than not, jail again. Among the multitude of approaches that seek to keep ex-prisoners on the right track, one stands out as being particularly successful: multisystemic therapy. The word therapy here may seem a misnomer. There are no 50-minute sessions one-on-one in a therapist's office. Instead, the intervention goes on smack in the midst of life, in the home, on the streets, at school, at whatever places and with whichever people the ex-inmate spends his time. A counselor shadows a released offender, getting to know his private world. He searches that world for strengths, like a good kid who could be a friend, an uncle who could be a mentor, a church that could offer a virtual family. And then the counselor sees to it that his charge spends time with those nourishing people and stays away from the ones whose influence might well lead to more jail time. No fancy therapeutics is involved here. The approach is pragmatic. Ratchet up levels of discipline and affection at home, decrease time spent with trouble-prone peers, work harder at school or get a job, and take part in sports. Most important, cultivate a web of healthy connections that will surround the offender with people who care and who can model a more responsible way of living. It's all done with people, extended family, neighbors, and friends. Though it lasts just 4 months, multisystemic therapy seems to work. For young offenders who have gone through the program, recidivism rates tracked over 3 years after release drop by anywhere from 25 to 70%. More impressively, these results apply to the most intransigent, difficult prisoners, those whose crimes were violent and serious. A government tally of prisoners' ages notes that the fastest growing group in prison are those in middle age. Virtually all of them have had years of crime behind them. Most are at the inevitable endpoint of a life in crime that began with their first arrest in their youth. That first arrest is the golden opportunity for intervening, for changing the vector of their lives away from criminality. That moment is pivotal, shunting a young person either into the revolving door of jail or away from it. If we adopt the programs that work, like reschooling the social brain, everyone will win. To be sure, a comprehensive plan like Kalamazoo's has many more parts. The list of what works also includes literacy and a job that pays enough to live on, as well as taking responsibility for one's actions. But all the parts share one goal: to help offenders learn to be better people, not better criminals. Chapter 21. From Them to Us. It was during the last years of apartheid in South Africa, the system of complete segregation between the ruling Dutch-descended Afrikaners and the colored groups. 30 people had been meeting clandestinely for 4 days. Half were white business executives, half black community organizers. The group was being trained to conduct leadership seminars together so they could help build governance skills within the black community. On the last day of the program, they sat riveted to a television set while President W.F. de Klerk gave a now famous speech that heralded the coming end of apartheid. De Klerk legalized a long list of previously banned organizations and ordered the release of many political prisoners. Anne Lorsebe, one of the black community leaders there, was beaming. As each organization was named, she pictured the face of someone she knew who could now come out of hiding. After the speech, the group went through an ending ritual in which each person had a chance to offer parting words. Most simply said how meaningful the training had been and how glad they were to have been there. But the fifth person to speak, a tall, emotionally reserved Afrikaner, stood and looked directly at Anne. "I want you to know," he told her, "that I was raised to think you were an animal." And with that, he broke into tears. Us-them restates I-it in the plural. The underlying dynamics are one and the same. As Walter Kaufmann, the English translator of Martin Buber, put it, with the words us-them, the world is divided in two, the children of light and the children of darkness, the sheep and the goats, the elect and the damned. The relationship between one of us and one of them, by definition, lacks empathy, let alone attunement. Should one of them presume to speak to one of us, the voice would not be heard as fully or openly as would that of one of us, if at all. The gulf that divides us from them builds with the silencing of empathy, and across that gulf we are free to project onto them whatever we like. As Kaufmann adds, righteousness, intelligence, integrity, humanity, and victory are the prerogatives of us, while wickedness, stupidity, hypocrisy, and ultimate defeat belong to them. When we relate to someone as one of them, we close off our altruistic impulses. Take, for example, a series of experiments in which volunteers were asked if they would be willing to get an electrical shock in place of someone else. The catch: they could not see the potential victim but simply heard a description of him or her. The more unlike themselves the other person was described as being, the more one of them, the more unwilling they were to come to their rescue. Hatred, said Elie Wiesel, the Nobel Peace Prize winner and Holocaust survivor, is a cancer that is passed from one person to another, one people to another. Human history chronicles an endless stream of horrors perpetrated by one group that turns viciously against another, even when that other group has far more similarities to than differences from themselves. Northern Irish Protestants and Catholics, like Serbs and Croatians, have battled over the years, though genetically they are each other's closest biological brothers and sisters. We confront the challenges of living in a global civilization with a brain that primarily attaches us to our home tribe. As a psychiatrist who grew up amid the ethnic turmoil of Cyprus put it, groups that are so much alike move from us to them via the narcissism of minor differences, seizing on small features that set the groups apart while ignoring their vast human similarities. Once the others are set at a psychological distance, they can become a target for hostility. This process is a corruption of a normal cognitive function, categorization. The human mind depends on categories to give order and meaning to the world around us. By assuming that the next entity we encounter in a given category has the same main features as the last, we navigate our way through an ever-changing environment. But once a negative bias begins, our lenses become clouded. We tend to seize on whatever seems to confirm the bias and ignore what does not. Prejudice, in this sense, is a hypothesis desperately trying to prove itself to us. And so when we encounter someone to whom the prejudice might apply, the bias skews our perception, making it impossible to test whether the stereotype actually fit. Openly hostile stereotypes about a group, to the extent they rest on untested assumptions, are mental categories gone awry. A vague sense of anxiety, a tinge of fear, or mere uneasiness at not knowing the cultural signals of them can be enough to start the skewing of a cognitive category. The mind builds its evidence against the other with each additional disquiet, each unflattering media depiction, each feeling of having been treated wrongly. As these incidents build, apprehension becomes antipathy. Antipathy morphs into antagonism. Outright anger primes prejudice even in those whose biases are slight. Like a match on Tinder, antagonism catalyzes the switch from us and them, the mere perception of difference, to us versus them, active hostility. Anger and fear, both amygdala-driven, amplify the destructiveness of a budding bias. When flooded by these strong emotions, the prefrontal area becomes incapacitated as the low road hijacks the high. This sabotages the ability to think clearly, thereby foiling a corrective answer to that essential question, does he really have all the bad traits I ascribe to them? And if a damning view of them has already been accepted, even in the absence of anger or fear, that question is no longer asked. Implicit bias. Us and them comes in many forms, from rabid hatred to unflattering stereotypes so subtle they elude even those who hold them. Such ultra-subtle prejudices hide in the low road, in the form of implicit biases, automatic and unconscious stereotypes. These quiet biases seem capable of driving responses, such as the decision of who to hire from a pool of equally qualified applicants, even when they do not fit our consciously held beliefs. People who show not the least outward sign of prejudice and who espouse positive views toward a group can still harbor hidden biases, as revealed by clever cognitive measures. For instance, the implicit assumption test offers you a word and asks you to match it to a category as quickly as you can. Its scale for hidden attitudes about whether women are as qualified as men for careers in science asks you to match words like physics and humanities to either women or men. We can make such a match most quickly when an idea fits the way we already think about something. Someone who believed that men are better at science than are women would be quicker when matching men and science-related words. These differences are counted in mere tenths of seconds and are discernible only by computer analysis. Such implicit biases, faint as they are, seem to skew judgments about people in a target group, as well as choices such as whether to work with someone or judgments of a defendant's guilt. When there are clear rules to follow, implicit biases have less effect, but the fuzzier the standards in a situation, the more powerful they become. One cognitive scientist, a woman, was shocked to find that a test of implicitly held biases revealed that she unconsciously endorsed a stereotype against women scientists, like herself. So she changed the decor in her office, surrounding herself with photos of famous women scientists like Marie Curie. Could that make a difference in her attitudes? It just might. At one time, psychologists saw unconscious mental categories like implicit attitudes as fixed because their influence works automatically and unconsciously. The assumption was that their consequences were inevitable. After all, the amygdala plays the key role in implicit bias, as well as in blatant prejudice, and low-road circuitry seemed difficult to sway. But more recent research has shown that automatic stereotypes and prejudices are fluid. Implicit biases do not reflect a person's true feelings, but can shift. At the neural level, this fluidity may reflect the fact that even the low road remains an eager learner throughout life. Take a simple experiment in stereotype reduction. People who held implicit biases against blacks were shown photos of widely admired blacks like Bill Cosby and Martin Luther King Jr., and of disliked whites like the serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer. The exposure was minimal, just a 15-minute session with a carefully selected set of 40 photos. That brief tutorial for the amygdala resulted in a dramatic shift in how those people scored on the test of implicit attitudes. Unconscious anti-black attitudes vanished, and the positive switch was still there when the volunteers were tested 24 hours later. Presumably, if such images of admired members of a target group were seen from time to time in booster sessions, or say as leading characters on a favorite TV show, the shift would persist. The amygdala learns continually and so need not stay stuck in bias. Many methods have been proven to reduce implicit bias, if only for the time being. When people were told that an IQ test showed they had high intelligence, their negative implicit biases vanished. But when they were told the test showed they had low intelligence, the biases strengthened. Implicit bias against blacks diminished after people were given positive feedback by a black supervisor. Social demands can do it. People who are put in a social setting where a prejudiced view is out of step register less implicit bias too. Even the explicit resolve to ignore a person's membership in a target group can reduce hidden prejudice. This finding dovetails with some neural judo. When people think or talk about their tolerant attitudes, the prefrontal area activates and the amygdala, the seat of implicit prejudice, quiets. As the high road engages in a positive way, the low road loses its power to stir bias. This neural dynamic may be at work in people who are going through programs that explicitly increase tolerance, such as the massive anti-discrimination initiatives of the U.S. military. A very different and rather novel way to neutralize prejudice a bit was discovered in Israeli experiments where people's sense of security was activated via subtle methods, like bringing to mind loved ones. Feeling momentarily more secure shifted prejudiced participants to a positive stance toward groups like Arabs and ultra-Orthodox Jews, both of whom had been among their initial targets of bias. When told they could spend time with an Arab or an ultra-Orthodox Jew, they were far more willing than they had been just minutes before. No one claims that such a fleeting sense of security can resolve long-standing historical and political conflict. Still, that demonstration adds to the case that even hidden prejudice can be lessened. Closing the hostile divide. Exactly what might repair us-them divides has been hotly debated for years among psychologists who study intergroup relations. But much of that debate has now been resolved by the work of Thomas Pettigrew, a social psychologist who has been studying prejudice ever since soon after the American Civil Rights Movement destroyed legal barriers between races. Pettigrew, a native of Virginia, was one of the first psychologists to plumb the heart of racial hatred. He began as a student of Gordon Allport, a social psychologist who argued that friendly and sustained contacts erode prejudice. Now, 3 decades later, Pettigrew has led the largest analysis of studies ever on what kinds of contact change hostile groups' views about each other. Pettigrew and his associates tracked down 515 studies dating from the 1940s to 2000 and combined them into a single massive statistical analysis, with responses from an astonishing 250,493 people from 38 countries. The us-them divides in the study range from black-white relations in the United States to a multitude of ethnic, racial, and religious animosities around the world, as well as biases against the elderly, disabled, and mentally ill. The strong conclusion? Emotional involvements, like friendships and romances between individuals from either side of a hostile divide, make people far more accepting of each other's groups. For instance, having had a childhood playmate from another group typically inoculates people against prejudice later in life, as was found in one study of African Americans who played with whites as children, though their schools were segregated at the time. The same effect operated under apartheid among those rural Afrikaner housewives who had become friends with their African domestic workers. Significantly, studies that track the time course of across-the-divide friendships show that the closeness itself leads to a reduction in prejudice. But mere casual contact on the street or at work does relatively little, if anything, to change hostile stereotypes. Pettigrew argues that the essential requirement for overcoming prejudice is a strong emotional connection. Over time, the warmth each person feels toward the other generalizes to all of them. For instance, when people had good friends across tense ethnic divides in Europe, Germans with Turks, French with North Africans, British with West Indians, the friends had far less prejudice toward the other group as a whole. You may still hold a general stereotype about them, but it's not connected to strong negative feelings anymore, Pettigrew told me. The crucial role of contact, or its absence, in prejudice was shown in studies Pettigrew did in Germany with colleagues there. East Germans are on average far more prejudiced against all groups, from Poles to Turks, than are people in West Germany, Pettigrew said. For example, acts of violence against minorities are much more frequent in the former East Germany than West. When we studied those arrested for such violence, we found two things. They are intensely prejudiced, and they have had virtually no contact with the groups they hate so much. In East Germany, even when the communist government took in large groups of Cubans or Africans, they were kept segregated, Pettigrew observed. But in West Germany, there have been decades of friendships across group lines, and we found the more contact Germans had with minorities, the more friendly they felt toward the group as a whole. When it becomes you, they turn into us. But what of implicit bias, the subtle stereotypes that slide under the radar of even those who profess to hold no bias? Don't they matter too? Pettigrew is skeptical. Groups often hold stereotypes about themselves that are widespread in their culture, he observed. For instance, I'm a Scot. My parents were immigrants. Scots are stereotyped as skinflints, but we turn that around, saying that we're just being thrifty. The stereotype remains, but the emotional valence has changed. Tests for implicit bias look at a person's cognitive categories, which in themselves are but cool abstractions, devoid of feeling. What counts about a stereotype, Pettigrew argues, is the feeling tone that goes with it. Simply holding a stereotype matters less than do the emotions attached. Given the intensity, even violence of some intergroup tensions, worrying about implicit bias may be a luxury reserved for places where prejudice has largely dwindled to subtleties rather than expressions of outright hatred. When groups are in conflict, emotions are what count. When they are getting along, the mental residues of outright prejudice matter to the extent that they foster subtle acts of prejudice. Pettigrew's research shows that holding negative feelings toward a group predicts hostile actions far more strongly than does holding an unflattering stereotype of them. Even after people from hostile groups form friendships, some of the original stereotypes remain, but their feelings warm up, and that makes the difference. Now I like them, even if I still hold on to the general stereotype, Pettigrew speculates. The implicit bias may stay, but if my emotions shift, my behavior will too. The jigsaw solution. To protect themselves from the intergroup frictions rampant in their large Manhattan high school, girls from Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic united into a single clique. But within that tight-knit clan, occasional bad feelings arose between Dominican and Puerto Rican factions. One day a fight started between two girls, when a Puerto Rican put down a Dominican for being too proud for such a recent immigrant. The two became enemies, splitting the group's loyalties. In high schools across America, students increasingly find themselves in an ever-diversifying ethnic mix. In this new global microcosm, the standard categories of discrimination, the ways us and them are defined, constantly reinvent themselves. The old categories, like blacks and whites, have been replaced by much subtler strains. In that Manhattan school, these divisions included not just blacks versus Latinos, but, among the Asians, ABCs, American-born Chinese, and FOBs, fresh off the boat. Given the projections for immigration into the United States over the next several decades, this multi-layered ethnic mix, with its expanding varieties of in and out groups, will only thicken the varieties of us and them. One sobering lesson in the costs of a socially splintered climate was the horrific shootings at Columbine High School on April 20th, 1999, when two outsider kids sought revenge by killing several fellow students, a teacher, and themselves. That tragedy inspired social psychologist Elliot Aronson to examine the problem, which he saw as having roots in school atmospheres that are competitive, cliquish, and exclusionary. In such a setting, Aronson saw teenagers agonize over the fact that there is a general atmosphere of taunting and rejection among their peers that makes the high school experience an unpleasant one. For many, it is worse than unpleasant. They describe it as a living hell, where they feel insecure, unpopular, put down, and picked on. Not only the United States, but countries from Norway to Japan have been grappling with the problem of how to stop children from bullying. Anywhere there are in students and outsiders whom other students shun and exclude, the problem of disconnection plagues the social world of the learner. That fact may seem to some a trivial side effect of the normal social currents that make some students stars and place others off the map. But research with people who are made to feel left out, or who are reminded that they belong to an outsider group, shows that such rejection can plummet them into a state of distractedness, anxious preoccupation, lethargy, and a sense that their lives are meaningless. Large doses of teen angst are brewed from this very fear of exclusion. Remember that the pain of ostracism registers in the node of the social brain that also reacts to actual physical pain. Social rejection in students can torpedo academic performance. Their capacity for working memory, the crucial cognitive ability for taking in new information, becomes impaired enough to account for an appreciable decline in mastery of subjects like math. Beyond having difficulties in learning, such disengaged students tend to have higher rates of violence and exhibit disruptive behavior in class, show poor attendance, and drop out at higher rates. The social universe of school is at the center of teenagers' lives. That fact presents a danger, as the data on alienation show, but also a promise. For school also offers every teenager a living laboratory for learning to connect positively with other people. Aronson took up the challenge of helping students connect in healthy ways. From social psychology, he knew one dynamic of moving from them to us. As people from hostile groups work together toward a common goal, they end up liking one another. So, Aronson advocated what he calls the jigsaw classroom, where students labor in teams to master an assignment on which they will be tested. Just as in a jigsaw puzzle, each student in the group holds one piece essential for full understanding. In studying World War II, for example, each team member becomes a specialist on one area, like military campaigns in Italy. The specialist studies that one topic with students from other groups. Then they go back to their home group and teach the others. To master the subject, the whole group must listen intently to what each has to say. If the others heckle them or tune out because they don't like them, they risk doing poorly on the test that follows. Learning itself becomes a lab that encourages listening, respect, and cooperation. Students in jigsaw learning groups quickly let go of their negative stereotypes. Likewise, studies in multicultural schools show that the more friendly contact students have across group divides, the less their bias. Take Carlos, a fifth grader who suddenly had to leave the school that most Mexican-American students like him attended and be bused across town to a school in a prosperous neighborhood. Kids in his new school were better informed in all the subjects than he was, and they ridiculed his accent. Carlos became an instant outsider, shy and insecure. But in the jigsaw classroom, the same students who had made fun of him now had to depend on his piece of the learning puzzle for their own success. At first, they put him down for his halting delivery, making him freeze, and they all did poorly. So they began to help and encourage him. The more they helped, the more relaxed and articulate Carlos became. His performance improved as his groupmates saw him in an increasingly favorable light. Several years later, out of the blue, Aronson got a letter from Carlos as he was about to graduate from a university. Carlos recalled how he had been scared, had hated school, and had thought he was stupid, and how the other kids had been cruel and hostile. But once he took part in the jigsaw classroom, that had changed, and his tormentors had become his friends. "I began to love to learn," Carlos wrote, "and now I'm about to go to Harvard Law School." Forgiving and forgetting. It was a cold December day, and the very Reverend James Parks Morton, former dean of New York City's Episcopal Cathedral and now director of the Interfaith Center, had very bad news for his staff. Their largest donors had cut back funding, and the center could no longer pay its rent. It was about to become homeless. Then, just a few days before Christmas, an unlikely savior came. Sheikh Musa Drama, an immigrant from Senegal, heard about their plight and offered the center room in a building where he was about to start a daycare center. In this rescue by a Muslim of a center where Buddhists, Hindus, Christians, Jews, Muslims, and others could meet to work on common problems, Dean Morton saw a fitting parable, one that validated the very mission of his group. As Drama put it, "The more we know about each other, and the more we are willing to sit down and drink and laugh together, the less we are inclined to shed blood." But what can be done to heal the hatred of peoples when they have shed blood? In the aftermath of intergroup violence, prejudice and animosity inevitably metastasize. Once hostilities have ceased, over and above harmonious relations, there are good personal reasons to speed the process. One is biological. Holding on to hatred and grudges has grave physiological consequence. Studies of people post-hostility reveal that every time they merely think of the group they hate, their own body responds with pent-up anger. It floods with stress hormones, raising their blood pressure and impairing their immune effectiveness. Presumably, the more often and intensely this sequence of muted rage repeats, the more risk of lasting biological consequence. One antidote lies in forgiveness. Forgiving someone we've held a grudge against reverses the biological reaction. It lowers our blood pressure, heart rate, and levels of stress hormones, and it lessens our pain and depression. Forgiveness can have social consequences, like making friends with former enemies, but it need not take that form. Especially while wounds are still fresh, forgiveness does not require condoning some offensive act, forgetting what happened, or reconciling with the perpetrator. It means finding a way to free oneself from the claws of obsession about the hurt. For a week, psychologists coached 17 men and women from Northern Ireland, both Catholic and Protestant, on forgiveness. Each of them had lost a family member to sectarian violence. During that week, the bereaved aired their grievances and were helped to find new ways to think about the tragedy, most resolving not to dwell on their hurt but to honor the memory of their loved ones by dedicating themselves to a more hopeful future. Many intended to help others go through the same ritual of forgiveness. Afterward, the group not only felt less hurt emotionally, but also reported a substantial drop in physical symptoms of trauma like poor appetite and sleeplessness. Forgive, perhaps, but don't forget. At least not entirely. There are larger lessons for humanity to learn from acts of oppression and brutality. They need to be held in mind as morality tales, reminders to the ages. As Rabbi Lawrence Kushner says of the Holocaust, "I want to remember its horror, only to make sure that such a thing never happens to me or to anyone else ever again." As Kushner puts it, having learned the most horrible lesson about what it means to be victimized by the full power of a technocratic state gone mad, the best response to that memory lies in helping other people who are in danger of genocide now. That motive lies behind the production of New Dawn, a weekly radio soap opera that is popular in Rwanda, where from 1990 to 1994, rampaging Hutus slaughtered 700,000 of their Tutsi neighbors, along with moderate Hutus who might oppose the killings. The soap's plot, set in the present, follows the tension simmering between two neighboring hardscrabble villages in dispute over fertile land that lies between them. In a Romeo and Juliet twist, Batamaliza, a young woman, has a romantic interest in Shema, a young man in the other village. To thicken the plot, her older brother, Rutanagira, leads a faction to their village that tries to goad hatred toward the other village to foment an attack on them, and he's trying to force Batamaliza to marry one of his cronies. Batamaliza, though, belongs to a group with friends in both her own and the other village. These young people cook up ways to oppose the troublemakers, like tipping off the targets of the planned attack and speaking out against the instigators. Just such active resistance to hatred was absent during the genocides of a decade ago. Cultivating the capacity to fight hatred is the subtext of New Dawn, a joint project of Dutch philanthropists and American psychologists. We're giving people an understanding of the influences that led to genocide, and what they can do to see it never repeats, says Irvin Staub, a psychologist at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and one of the designers of the show. Staub knows about the dynamics of genocide from personal experience as well from his research. As a child, he was one of tens of thousands of Hungarian Jews saved from the Nazis by Swedish ambassador Raoul Wallenberg. Staub's book, The Roots of Evil, summarizes the psychological forces that spawn much mass murder. The groundwork gets laid during severe social upheavals, like economic crises and political chaos, in places that have a history of division between a dominant group and a less powerful one. The turmoil causes members of a majority group to find appealing the ideologies that scapegoat a weaker group, blaming them for the problem and envisioning a better future that they are preventing. The hatred spreads all the more readily when the majority group has itself been victimized in the past and still feels wounded or wronged. Already seeing the world as dangerous, when tensions rise, they feel a need to resort to violence against them to defend themselves, even when their self-defense amounts to genocide. Several features make such violence more likely. When the targets are unable to speak up to defend themselves, and bystanders, those who could object, or people in nearby countries, say and do nothing. If others are passive when you first harm the victims, the perpetrators interpret that silence as an endorsement, Staub says. And once people start the violence, step by step, they exclude their victim from the moral realm. Then there's nothing to hold them back. Staub, working with psychologist Lorianne Perlman, has been teaching these insights and antidotes to hatred, like objecting openly, to Rwandan groups of politicians, journalists, and community leaders. We asked them to apply these insights to their own experience of what happened. It's very powerful. We're trying to promote community healing and build the tools to resist the forces of violence. Their research shows that both Hutus and Tutsis who have gone through such training feel less traumatized by what happened to them and are more accepting of the other group. But it takes more than strong emotional connections and friendship to overcome the us-them divide. Forgiveness may not help when the groups continue to live next to each other, Staub finds, and when the perpetrators fail to acknowledge what they have done, show no regret, and express no empathy for survivors. The imbalance widens if the forgiveness is one-sided. Staub distinguishes forgiveness from reconciliation, which is the honest review of oppression and efforts at making amends like those undertaken by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa after the fall of apartheid. In his programs in Rwanda, reconciliation has meant that those on the side of the perpetrators admit what was done, and people on both sides come to see each other more realistically. That paves the way for both peoples to live together in a new way. Tutsis will tell you, Staub finds, some Hutus tried to save our lives. I'm willing to work with them for the sake of our children. If they apologize, I can see myself forgive. Epilogue. What really matters? I once met a man who had been invited to spend a week on a private yacht touring the Greek islands. It wasn't just any yacht, but a super yacht. A mini steamship so long it was listed in a special registry of the largest pleasure boats in the world. A copy of that registry sat on a nearby table. The thick, richly illustrated volume had a 2-page spread devoted to the lavish details of each super yacht. The dozen or so guests aboard were thrilled by the comforts and the sheer immensity of the sleek craft, until the day an even bigger yacht anchored nearby. Consulting the registry, they discovered that their new nautical neighbor was among the 5 largest yachts in the world and belonged to a Saudi prince. On top of that, it had an accompanying tender, a sister ship that carried its supplies, such as a huge water trampoline hanging from the bow. The tender itself was about the size of their own boat. Can there be such a thing as yacht envy? Absolutely, according to Daniel Kahneman, a Princeton University psychologist. Such high-end envy results from what he dubs the hedonic treadmill. Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize in economics, uses the image of a treadmill to explain why enhanced life circumstances, like greater wealth, correlate poorly with life satisfaction. In explaining why the wealthiest people are not the happiest, Kahneman argues that as we get more money, we adapt our expectations upward, and so we aspire to ever more lofty and expensive pleasures, a treadmill that never ends, even for billionaires. As he puts it, the rich may experience more pleasure than the poor, but they also require more pleasure to be equally satisfied. But Kahneman's research also suggests one way to escape from the hedonic treadmill: a life rich in rewarding relationships. He and a research team surveyed more than 1,000 American women, asking them to evaluate all their activities during a given day in terms of what they were doing, who they were with at the time, and how they felt. The most powerful influences on how happy the women felt were the people with whom they spent their time, not their income, not job pressures, and not their marital status. The two most pleasurable activities were, to no one's surprise, making love and socializing. Least enjoyable were the daily commute and work. And the rankings of which people primed happiness? Here is the list from top to bottom. Friends, relatives, spouse or partner, children, clients or customers, co-workers, boss, being alone. Kahneman suggests, in effect, that we take stock of the people in our lives and the pleasure we get in being with them, then try to optimize our day by spending more time with them in satisfying ways, to the extent that schedules and money allow. But beyond such obvious logistical solutions, a richer possibility is to recreate our relationships to make them more mutually nourishing. Surely much of what makes life worth living comes down to our feelings of well-being, our happiness and sense of fulfillment, and good quality relationships are one of the strongest sources of such feelings. Emotional contagion means that a goodly number of our moods come to us via the interactions we have with other people. In a sense, resonant relationships are like emotional vitamins, sustaining us through tough times and nourishing us daily. Among people around the world, nourishing relationships are the single most universally agreed upon feature of the good life. While the specifics vary from culture to culture, all people everywhere deem warm connections with others to be the core feature of optimal human existence. As we saw in Chapter 15, the marital researcher John Gottman has found that in a happy, stable marriage, a couple experiences about 5 upbeat interactions for every negative one. Perhaps that same 5-to-1 ratio is an approximate golden mean for any ongoing connection in our lives. We could, in theory, do an inventory that evaluates the nutritional value of each of our relationships. If, say, the ratio were reversed to 5 negative for every positive interaction, the relationship would be in urgent need of mending. A negative ratio, of course, does not necessarily mean we should end relationships just because they are sometimes, or even too often, difficult. The point is to do what we can to alter the troubling behavior for the better, not banish the person. Armies of experts propose solutions here. Some work only if others are willing to try too. If not, we can still boost our own resilience and social intelligence, so changing our part in the emotional tango. Of course, we also need to weigh how we affect the lives of those close to us. How we impact others speaks to how we fulfill our very responsibilities as caring spouses, relatives, friends, and members of our communities. An I-you approach to others lets empathy proceed to its natural next step, concerned action. The social brain then acts as our built-in guidance system for charity, good works, and compassionate acts. Given the raw social and economic realities of our time, this caring sensibility and social intelligence may carry an ever greater premium. Social engineering. Martin Buber believed that the growing preponderance of I-it relationships in modern societies threatens human well-being. He warned against the thingification of people, the depersonalization of relationships that corrodes our quality of life and the human spirit itself. One prophetic voice that anticipated Buber was George Herbert Mead, an early 20th century American philosopher. Mead originated the idea of the social self, the sense of identity we form as we see ourselves in the mirror of our relationships. Mead proposed as a singular goal for social progress a perfected social intelligence with greatly heightened rapport and mutual understanding. Such utopian ideals for the human community may seem out of sync with the tragedies and frictions of the 21st century. And the scientific sensibility in general, not just in psychology, has long been uncomfortable with the moral dimension, which many scientists would rather relegate to the humanities, to philosophy or theology. But the exquisite social responsiveness of the brain demands that we realize that not just our own emotions, but our very biology is being driven and molded, for better or for worse, by others. And in turn, that we take responsibility for how we affect the people in our lives. Buber's message for us today warns against an outlook that is indifferent to how others suffer and that uses social skills for purely selfish ends. And it commends the stance that empathizes and cares, a nurturing outlook that takes responsibility for others as well as for oneself. That dichotomy has implications for social neuroscience itself. As always, the identical scientific insights can find malign or benign applications. An Orwellian use of social neuroscience findings could be their misapplication in, say, advertising or propaganda. fMRI readings of a target group's response to a given message would be used to fine-tune and amplify the message's emotional impact. In such a scenario, the science devolves into a tool that allows media manipulators to drive home exploitative messages ever more powerfully. That's nothing new. Unintended consequences of new inventions are an inevitable underside of technological progress. Each new generation of gadgetry floods society before we can fully know the difference it will make. The next new thing is always a social experiment in progress. On the other hand, social neuroscientists are already planning far more benign applications. One of them would apply the discovery of a logarithm for empathy, that physiological match during moments of rapport, to train medical residents and psychotherapists to empathize better with patients. Another would use an ingenious fanny pack with physiology monitoring wireless technology. Patients could wear it at home, 24 hours a day. It would automatically send a signal when it recognizes that the patient has begun falling, say, into an episode of depression. A virtual psychiatrist on call. Our emerging understanding of the social brain and the effects of our social connections on our biology also point to a range of ways we might re-engineer social institutions for the better. Given the nourishment offered by wholesome connection, the ways we treat the sick, the elderly, and the imprisoned must be reconsidered. For the chronically ill or dying, for instance, we might do more than pool volunteers from a patient's family and social circle to help, but also find support for the helpers. For the elderly, who are now so often tucked away in bleak and solitary arrangements, we might instead offer co-housing, residences where people of all ages live together and share many meals, so recreating the extended family that harbored the aged through most of human history. And as we've seen, we can refocus our correction system to affirm decent connections for prisoners rather than cutting them off from the very human ties that could help set them straight. Then consider those who staff these institutions, from schools to hospitals to prisons. All these sectors are vulnerable to the accountant's delusion that the social goals can be assessed by fiscal measures alone. That mentality ignores the emotional connections that drive our very ability to be and work at our best. Leaders need to realize that they themselves set much of the emotional tone that flows through the halls of their organizations, and that this in turn has consequence for how well the collective objectives are met, whether the outcome is measured in achievement test scores, sales goals, or retention of nurses. And for all of this, as Edward Thorndike proposed in 1920, we need to nurture social wisdom, the qualities that allow the people we connect with to flourish. The gross national happiness. The small Himalayan kingdom of Bhutan takes seriously their country's gross national happiness, which they deem as important as the gross domestic product, a standard economic indicator. Public policy, the king declared, should be linked to people's sense of well-being, not just to economics. To be sure, the pillars of national happiness in Bhutan include financial self-reliance, a pristine environment, health care, education preserving local culture, and democracy. But economic growth in itself is just part of the equation. The gross national happiness is not just for Bhutan. The notion of placing as much or more value on people's happiness and life satisfaction as on economic growth per se has been embraced by a small but growing international group of economists. They see as misguided the universal assumption in policy circles worldwide that the consumption of more goods means people feel better off. They are developing new ways to measure well-being in terms not just of income and employment, but also of satisfaction with personal relationships and a sense of purpose in life. Daniel Kahneman noted the well-documented lack of correlation between economic advantages and happiness, apart from a large boost at the very bottom when people go from being impoverished to being able to make a sparse living. Recently, the realization has dawned among economists that their hyper-rational models ignore the low road, and emotions in general, and so fail to predict with full precision the choices people will make, let alone what makes them happy. The term technological fix, meaning tech-engineered interventions in human affairs, was coined by Alvin Weinberg, a longtime director of the Oak Ridge National Laboratory and founder of the Institute for Energy Analysis. Weinberg came of age in the science of the 1950s and 1960s, an era given to the utopian vision that coming technologies offered panaceas for a range of human and social ills. One such proposal was a massive system of nuclear power plants that were supposed to lower energy costs radically, and if placed on an ocean shore, provide ample drinking water, so boosting the welfare of entire nations. Lately, a number of environmentalists have endorsed nuclear power as one solution to global warming. Now, as he has reached 90, Weinberg's views have taken a philosophical and cautionary turn. Technology makes it easier and easier to disconnect from other people and from ourselves, Weinberg told me. Civilization is in the midst of a vast singularity. What was once meaningful has been wiped away. Lives are lived sitting in front of a computer screen, getting personal connections at a distance. We live in a meta world with our focus fixed on the latest technology, but the issues that matter most are families, community, and social responsibility. As a presidential science advisor in the 1960s, Weinberg wrote an influential paper on what he called criteria for scientific choice. The paper introduced the notion that values could guide choices in science spending and were a valid question in the philosophy of science. Now, nearly a half-century later, he's been reflecting further on what's useful or worthwhile in setting a nation's spending priorities. He tells me, the conventional view holds that capitalism is the only efficient way to allocate resources, but it lacks compassion. I wonder whether the possibilities of our economic models are being exhausted, and whether the high level of global unemployment we're seeing is actually structural and very deep, not a passing phenomenon. Perhaps there will always be a sizable and probably growing number of people who just can't find good jobs. And then, I wonder, how might we modify our system so that it's not just efficient, but compassionate? Paul Farmer, the public health crusader, legendary for his work in Haiti and Africa, also decries the structural violence done by an economic system that keeps so many of the world's poor too sick to escape their plight. For Farmer, one solution lies in treating health care as a human right and making its delivery a prime concern rather than an afterthought. The economic theories that currently drive national policies, however, have few ways to take human suffering into account, although the economic costs of disasters like floods or famines are routinely estimated. One of the most graphic results has been policies that burden the poorest countries with such huge debts that they have too little left to pay for food or medical care for their children. This economic attitude seems mind-blind, lacking the ability to imagine the other's reality. Empathy is essential for a compassionate capitalism, one where human misery and its alleviation carry weight. That argues for building a society's capacity for compassion. For example, economists might do well to study the wider benefits to society of socially intelligent parenting and of school curricula on social and emotional skills, both in the education system and in prisons. Such society-wide efforts to optimize the workings of the social brain might cascade into lifetime paybacks, both for children and for the communities where they live out their years. These benefits would range, I suspect, from higher achievement in school to better performance at work, from happier and more socially able children to better community safety and lifetime health. And people who are more educated, safer, and healthier contribute the most to any economy. Grand speculations aside, warmer social connections could have immediate payoffs for us all. The raw buzz of fellow feeling. The poet Walt Whitman, in his exuberant anthem, I Sing the Body Electric, put it lyrically, I have perceived that to be with those I like is enough. To stop in company with the rest at evening is enough. To be surrounded by beautiful, curious, breathing, laughing flesh is enough. I do not ask any more delight. I swim in it as in a sea. There is something in staying close to men and women and looking on them, and in the contact and odor of them that pleases the soul well. All things please the soul, but these please the soul well. Vitality arises from sheer human contact, especially from loving connections. The people we care about most are an elixir of sorts, an ever-renewing source of energy. The neural exchange between a parent and child, a grandparent and a toddler, between lovers or a satisfied couple, or among good friends, has palpable virtues. Now that neuroscience can put numbers to that raw buzz of fellow feeling, quantifying its benefits, we must pay attention to the biological impact of social life. The hidden links among our relationships, our brain function, and our very health and well-being are stunning in their implications. We must reconsider the pat assumption that we are immune to toxic social encounters. Save for the passing stormy mood, we often suppose our interactions matter little to us at any biological level. But this turns out to be a comforting illusion. Just as we catch a virus from someone else, we may also catch an emotional funk that makes us more vulnerable to that same virus, or otherwise undermines our well-being. From this perspective, strong distressing states like disgust, contempt, and explosive anger are the emotional equivalent of secondhand smoke that quietly damages the lungs of others who breathe it in. The interpersonal equivalent of health boosting would be adding positive emotions to our surroundings. In this sense, social responsibility begins here and now, when we act in ways that help create optimal states in others, from those we encounter casually to those we love and care about most dearly. In accord with Whitman, one scientist who studies the survival value of sociability says the practical lesson for us all comes down to nourish your social connections. Well and good for our personal lives, but all of us are buffeted by the vast social and political currents of our time. The last century highlighted what divides us, confronting us with the limits to our collective empathy and compassion. Through most of human history, the bitter antagonisms that stoked hatred between groups were manageable in a strictly logistical sense. The limited means of destruction available kept the damage relatively small. In the 20th century, however, technology and organizational efficiency made the destructive potential of such hatred immensely greater. As a poet of those times, W.H. Auden, so pungently prophesied, "We must love one another or die." His stark outlook captures the urgency wrought by hatreds unleashed. But we need not be helpless. That sense of urgency can serve as a collective awakening, reminding us that the crucial challenge for this century will be to expand the circle of those we count among us and shrink the numbers we count as them. The new science of social intelligence offers us tools that can push those boundaries outward, step by step. For one, we need not accept the divisions that hatred breeds, but rather extend our empathy to understand one another despite our differences and to bridge those divides. The social brain's wiring connects us all at our common human core. We hope you've enjoyed this Audio Renaissance production of Social Intelligence. This program was produced by Laura Wilson, post-production by Tim Franklin. Text copyright 2006 by Daniel Goleman. Production copyright 2006 by Audio Renaissance, a division of Holtzbrink Publishers, LLC. All rights reserved.